Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Rideau Hall Foundation, welcome to the Path Forward, Indigenous-led Innovations in Education. We're so glad to have you with us today. Before we begin, I would like to invite Dr. Sherri Chisan, who is one of our panelists, to open up today's session in ceremony. Welcome, Dr. Chisan.
Hi. I ask you each to join me in your own way, and offering your thanks. Today I have our medicines. We have sweetgrass and sage and cedar that help to cleanse us and cleanse our spaces and help to invite spirit to help us with our work. And so there are many ways to pray, and one of the ways that I feel comfortable is with song. And this particular song helps me to remember what my responsibilities are. This is the way that I learned the Rainbow Woman song. There are many Rainbow Woman songs, and even this one might be sung different ways by different people. And the Rainbow Woman is a grandmother, a spirit guide, who helps us to be ready to come to this human world, and readies us with gifts, talents, abilities that we will carry on behalf of our people. And it's the responsibility of our people to witness and nurture these gifts, these talents, but it's also our responsibility to use them in the best way that we can for our people. So sometimes this song reminds me that I'm here for a specific purpose, a reason, and so is everybody else. And so I'll ask the Rainbow Grandmother to be with us today as we gather. I thank you for that opportunity. Okay.
Thank you for sharing that beautiful song with us. So my name is Denise Baxter, Indigenous Makwadodem, Martin Falls, and Donjaba, and I serve as the Vice Provost of Indigenous Initiatives at Lakehead University on the Thunder Bay campus right now. And I'm also a member of the National Advisory Committee for the Rideau Hall Foundation, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I'm joining you from the beautiful Robinson Huron Treaty area, in the shadow of Anemkiwaju, the community also known as Fort William First Nation. And I encourage you to share where you are joining us from in the chat today. I know we have people from across the Turtle Island joining us, and it's always nice to see where people are coming from. The Rideau Hall Foundation is an independent and charitable organization that aims to connect people, causes, and organizations that share a common belief and commitment to learning, leadership, giving, and innovation. And through the Rideau Hall Foundation's Indigenous Teacher Education Program initiative, we seek to amplify the importance of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis teachers and the value that they bring to students in their communities. This is an interactive event, and we invite you not only to tell us where you're from, but if you have any questions as they come into your mind, please put them in the chat. We have moderators that will be there with you that will be sending me the questions, and I don't want you to forget those questions, but we'll address them towards the last half hour of our presentation today. Today's panel will shine a light on excellence and innovation within the Indigenous teacher education field, as well as why is it critical for Canada to have more First Nations, Inuit, and Métis teachers. You'll hear from 3 panelists who will share their perspective on what being Indigenous-led means and why it's important to have Indigenous programs developed for and by Indigenous people, including how this will enrich the Indigenous teacher education landscape. So I'm very excited to introduce 3 people that will be sharing with us today. We have Dr. Sherri Chisan, Chisholm, there, I got it right, I think, president of Blue Quills, today, and also from Treaty 6 territory in Dakota. The project that Blue Quills University is working on means to teach children. And this innovative project aims to create 3 distinct teacher education streams, one in immersion, one in elementary, and one in secondary, offering entry pathways for Indigenous non-BEd students. Language revitalization, cultural teachings, and land-based education will reshape the curriculum and instructional methods, and fundamentally transforming how Indigenous teachers are trained. So welcome. Our second panelist is Dr. Ramona Neckoway, who is the Vice President, Indigenous Initiatives and Reconciliation at the University College of the North in Manitoba. The project that she is leading is called Teacher Training and Language Revitalization in Northern Manitoba, Building Capacity Together. Located in Northern Manitoba, UCN seeks to unlock the potential of their students and local community, which is over 70% Indigenous. This 5-year project aims to expand teacher training with semi-remote pathways, enhanced language certifications, facilitate transitions from our Bachelor of Education and Bachelor of Arts programs, and to implement a literacy readiness initiative with land-based and language training support. And our final and third panelist is Melanie Bennett, Executive Director of Directorate, which is a partnership between Yukon First Nation Education Directorate, Yukon University, and the First Nation School Board. The project name is Collaborative Indigenous Teachers Education Program, which is a 4-year program aimed to transform education by challenging inequitable approaches and celebrating Indigenous cultures. Through initiatives like dual credit courses and involving local knowledge holders, the goal is to bridge the education gap and create a culturally responsive learning environment for Indigenous students. So we're very pleased to have the 3 of you join us today. So I'd like to extend a wholehearted thanks on behalf of and all of us who are going to have the opportunity to do a bit of learning alongside you today. So we will be discussing a range of topics. I'll be guiding the conversation with some questions. And after that, for all those watching, we'll open up the chat option for your questions. So again, I urge you to start thinking of anything you'd like to ask, or if questions come up while our speakers are sharing, please just put them into the chat and we'll address them towards the end. We are going to keep this discussion lively and engaging, and we'll aim to wrap up in about an hour and 20 minutes or 4 p.m. Eastern time. So the first question, and I'm going to invite Dr. Chisan to speak first to it. What does Indigenous-led mean to you, and why is this important to your program and partners?
First, I want to acknowledge that I'm at University nuxełhot'įne thaaヂehots'ĩ in nistameyimâkanak Blue Quills. It's Dene and Neckoway reference to our ancestors. And we are reminded that treaties are not land surrenders, so we acknowledge we are on the unceded lands in Treaty 6 territory. We're actually a schoolhouse on reserve, identified by land, language, ceremony, and relationship. And you know, there's something magical. I've been working at the university, an Indigenous-owned and governed university. So for me, it goes beyond Indigenous-led. It's Indigenous-owned and governed. And I've been here for 26 years, and there's comfort in knowing the staff, the faculty, the students, the community, and the workplace. A shared context in history, cultural practices, not feeling like we're visitors in someone else's space. We have a supportive and culturally appropriate learning environment. So there's ceremony on campus all year round, not just hidden in a corner some way. And we're not having to convince administration about the value of Indigenous knowledge and practice. And I know that I've heard about that from a lot of our relatives that work in public institutions, how hard they have to work just to create a space. Also, we need more teachers, because our children need to see themselves reflected in their teachers and in their administration, but other children need to see our teachers there as well, to see them as role models, to ensure that they create a relevance in the curriculum, to see their teachers at their community events in social contexts, and to be able to identify positively with them. I think also that the program that we're designing is going to prioritize Indigenous knowledge and access to Indigenous knowledge carriers. We also talk about truth and reconciliation and truth before reconciliation. So there's a lot of truths yet to be told. And while the TRC did good work in raising awareness about the harms and history of and the trauma of Indian residential schools, there's also a history of provincial schools, public schools, and the experiences that our people have had there. And so we say that to assume that people of other cultures can come into our lands are the only ones that can train teachers, or that we must train teachers their way, perpetuates a colonial belief in a cultural superiority. And so we need to raise up our own knowledge, our own ways of teaching, our own ways of learning. Our people have been doing this forever, for as long as there's been human memory in this land. We know that we know how to do this. So we're very happy to have the support to have that space here. Also, we're looking to NIAB and WINHEC, National Indigenous Accreditation Board, and the WINHEC Higher Education Consortium for program accreditation and teacher certification, but also working alongside the systems that exist. And so one of the things that you might often hear is we're saying nothing about us without us. And how do we get that message through to everybody in this system? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And you've brought up some great things, and we'll see if the other people are picking up on the same thread or different threads, but certainly what struck me in that was around Indigenous governance. And so thank you for that. I'd like to now invite Dr. Neckoway to respond to the question, what does Indigenous-led mean to you?
Thanks, Denise, and happy to be joining everybody today. I'm here on Treaty 5 territory, and our campus is located on the homelands of Nistameyimâkanak Nation. For me, Indigenous-led means delivering programming that's responsive and meaningful to community. And the proposal that we put forward is really, we took cue from our Kinanau learning model. This is our Faculty of Education learning model. And it's really, the elders had talked about the importance of land, language, history, and reflecting content that was meaningful for students and folks that would come into those learning environments. And here at UCN, we've got a governance structure that really nurtures and incorporates and makes that space for Indigenous knowledges in the curriculum. And so Indigenous-led is being an active participant in the development of curricula, in the development of learning pathways that reflect Indigenous worldviews, practices, customs. And the elders remind us that education took place through families, and communities played a big role in education and in the act of educating. So again, we really built upon principles that lie within our Kinanau learning model. And this is important because it makes Indigenous knowledges visible. As academic institutions, we create that space here at UCN for those knowledges to really become centered, and working with Indigenous knowledge keepers is a really big component of what we're proposing to do in creating these different and innovative pathways. So Indigenous-led means creating the visibility and translating some of that cultural knowledge into programming, into policy, into pathways that we're able to create through this initiative.
Thank you for that. And finally, Melanie, Bennett, if I could turn it over to you. The same question about what does it mean to be Indigenous-led for both you and your partners?
I am coming to you from the traditional territories of the Kwanlundan First Nation and the T'a'n Council. I am a very happy member of the Trondakachin First Nation in Yukon. In Yukon, we have 11 self-governing First Nations and 3 unceded. And so our work in this, I would say for Indigenous-led, is first and foremost, it must come from community. And we have to hold space for that. So when we say we're doing this Indigenous-led, we need to be able to hold the space so that we can do the things that the 2 previous speakers talked about, where it's our ways, and there's room for us to be able to share those and demonstrate them without judgment or bias from anyone. When you have space in a system that allows Indigenous-led, there is no questioning, because Indigenous-led doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming from the only Indigenous person in the room. It means that those pedagogies, philosophies, the worldview, our ways, as we say, we would, in my language, we say thaaၤehots'ĩ. It's coming from that space, and there's room for it to pass on. We have to really look at how that system is, and the way our worldview is, in that everything does come from the family. We are matriarchal in the Yukon, and it comes back to that base. So I don't like using the words of defining. I'd rather that people step into the realm and learn to understand what that is. And then the actual space of going past Indigenous-led to it's embedded would be probably the most important thing to myself. And what we do as an Indigenous educator myself for 30 plus years, it can be exhausting to always be explaining and teaching and having folks to learn and understand, even though they're willing. So when we get to that space where it isn't just the First Nations doing it, as we would say, it would be all. And I think that's one of the things within truth and reconciliation. Yes, there has to be truth first, but the reconciliation piece is about, it isn't just shouldered by the First Nations, it's shouldered by all. Masi.
Okay, so we've covered some really great pieces around that. And I appreciate from Melanie the concept around it being past led to embedded, because then as leadership changes, the work still continues in such a fashion. So really great points from all 3 people that were speaking so far. And the next question, again, is for all of you. And it really is around those wise practices. You've touched upon some of those pieces when you were speaking to the last question around leadership. But what are the wise practices that you can share around building up Indigenous-led or embedded teacher education programs? You can take a bit of a longer answer because we do have a little bit of time here. So if I could again ask Sherri to start off, what are the wise practices that you can share around building up Indigenous-led teacher education programs?
I think it starts with who we are. It starts with knowing who we are and why we're here. It starts with thaaၤehots'ĩ, words in our language that reference our relations, and that we know that we're related not just to each other as human beings, but we're related to the world, all of the other beings in the world, the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the swimmers, the crawlers, the trees, the plants, and we need to approach life in that context. And then that informs our teaching methods. It informs how we engage with each other in our personal relationships. I think also our students need to know that their instructors understand their lived experience and probably have shared some of that lived experience, and can relate to them in that way. Of course, creating a cultural learning environment. So it's not just an add-on, or it's not just something that happens over there. It's something that happens everywhere in their learning environment. So for example, at Blue Quills, you walk into any classroom and there will be medicines there so that they can have a smudging ceremony before they start their work. If you walk down the trail, you'll find a sweat lodge, and you'll find other lodges that we do at different times of year. And so people will recognize themselves in that. And sometimes just seeing that lets them know that they're home. We also have been working with some other First Nations institutions on a project called the Turtle Lodge Treaty. And it was prepared in 2013, and it was taken to the Turtle Lodge that late Dave Kershane put up in Sagin in Manitoba. And there was a gathering of elders from all across the country and many different nations. And they looked at this Turtle Lodge Treaty, they made some revisions to it, and they endorsed it. And what it is it's an agreement among people and among nations to protect Indigenous knowledges and languages, so that they don't become something that's called intellectual property, which turns them into, the legal term is chattels, things, commodities. And that we take this very seriously, and that to be able to teach Indigenous knowledges and languages, and I'm happy to acknowledge the other speakers talked about, it has to come from community. And so, and people who live in community and who spend their time in community, and that it needs to be endorsed by community. So then we're talking about community involvement in everything that we're doing. We're talking about engaging with elders and knowledge carriers, with parents, with students, with teachers, to get feedback on our programming, which will lead to cultural relevancy and developing a curriculum that's more holistic and aligns with our worldviews. So we know that our people have always been educators. We've always been transferring their relevant skills, as well as any social, political, economic, technical, spiritual, philosophical knowledge, all that we need to know to be able to survive. And I know that I've learned through ceremony, and our ancestors have told us that before others even came to this land, we knew they were coming. And we were told that they were coming to learn from us on how to be, how to live in these lands. And unfortunately, we know that that relationship has not manifested in the way that we anticipated, but we're starting to see that happen. We're starting to see people come to us for our knowledge and want to know what it is that we know. We also know that we need to teach our teachers what we want our children to know. And now we need to teach our teachers. We need to teach the ones who teach our teachers what we need our children to know. And in fact, we need to teach all of our relations, our partners who share this space with us, and ensure that our knowledge has a place there.
You made me start thinking, as I was thinking about those who teach teachers. And, there are many different kinds of ways that that teacher candidates are learning, if they're teacher candidates, but also actively teaching right in schools at this moment. So thank you very much for that. I would like to pose the same question to Ramona. If you would please think about sharing wise practices with us as we move forward.
Thanks, Denise. So here at UCN, I think we've got some really interesting policies and processes and pathways that we're embarking on and that we have embarked on. One of the things I'd like to talk about is the role and place of collaboration. So, doing the kind of work and projects that are being undertaken, across a number of institutions, across a number of spaces requires really neat collaborations with institutions, with communities, with knowledge keepers, with elders. So again, I'm going to lean a little bit here into the importance of community and building relationships and that concept of thaaꞌehots'ĩ and the relations and relationality as part of those processes. Here we've got a Council of Elders. So the Council of Elders is really involved and embedded into the structure of UCN. We've got a new Indigenous curriculum policy that says, that is actually mandating that the courses have at least one Indigenous learning outcome. And this is important because it gives us an opportunity and a platform to integrate Indigenous knowledges into a variety of curricula. And so in that way, we're making Indigenous knowledge accessible and visible. We've got our Center for Aboriginal Language and Culture, which is doing some really neat things around Indigenous language revitalization. And again, this is an opportunity to create space and create avenues to pursue primary research. These are not great words to use, but this is the vocabulary that we've got to center Indigenous knowledge and create tools and resources that are going to be important for folks teaching educators and carrying that knowledge forward into the spaces that we have or that we are creating in post-secondary environments. So yeah, those are some wise practices that I can share here at UCN. We're also looking to incorporate new innovations with respect to some of the pathways that we're taking and reaching new audiences. So that's a pretty exciting development, and I may get a chance to speak to that in a little bit here.
Thank you for that. And so the final question, we'll give Melanie an opportunity to speak to the wise practices that you can share around building up Indigenous-led teacher education programs.
Thank you, Masi. Here in Yukon, the Indigenous teacher program we have is known as the Yukon Native Teacher Education Program, lovingly called YNTEP. Has been around for a very long time, but it went through some significant changes that brought actually more challenges to the First Nations in regards to having our citizens participate and become teachers. Some of the wise practices that have occurred, one in particular that I'm extremely attuned to is mentorship. Having that whole model of C1B1 with our students as they transition into the teacher education programs is really, really important. And then carried on through when they transition into actually teaching. Many times I've seen, and I know myself as I experienced when I, a long, long time ago, graduated from university and moved into the education system. I was the only First Nations teacher in the school. And very quickly, I used to tease my colleagues and say, I'm not dialoculture. I don't know the answer to that, and we need to go and find that out. Because you would often be leaned upon by other teachers who want to do in the best interest of our kids within the school system, but the resources are really not there. The knowledgeable resources are not there. We don't have that capacity built up yet. And so one of the pieces that we're going to be working on is to have a stronger mentorship, that when we transition students into and transition them out of into the actual school systems. We are already seeing with some of the program we're doing here at YFNED strong practices in that. Coming from community is really important. Identifying from each community what is it that is best for your community, and then the ability to be able to do as much of it in community. Many times we've heard from some of our candidates that were students within the system that they didn't continue on because they missed home and they wanted to go home. So finding ways that we can actually do the teaching program from their community is a very strong practice right now. And then that transition into when they're in the workforce of validity. So I really liked hearing what Sherri and Ramona were saying about really building up our people. And I think it was Sherri who said, nothing about us without us. When that is really there, then it's everybody's responsibility and everybody is towing the rope in the same direction. So that's really a piece that when we have our capacity built up with more First Nations educators in the system, there isn't that sense of loneliness. Everybody will be working together to ensure that our ways and our First Nations people's success in the education system will be there, not just in graduating our students, but bringing them home to be able to teach in their community as well. So I would say for me, probably my favorite best, I'm only going to say one because there's many best practices, would be that integrated embedded mentorship.
Thank you. That integrated embedded membership also to add to in preparing teacher candidates for the actual classroom, but also, as their early career. And then once they get through that early career, what a nice way to circle back to share what they've learned with other new candidates coming in and really keeping that cycle of that circle strong and continuing to grow and learn. So thank you so much for sharing that little piece with us. We have we have a lot of time here, so we have a lot of questions. So just to keep things moving, but I hope those of you that are listening, as people are speaking to different things, if they're piquing your interest or you wish to learn more, please remember to put your questions in the chat so that we can address them in about 25 minutes or so. So this next question is for two panelists, Dr. Chisan and Dr. Neckoway. We've talked about what it means to be Indigenous-led or Indigenous-governed, and also wise practices. But now I'd like to focus specifically on the Indigenous teacher education programs. So our third question, and if we can, we'll start with Sherri again. How has this funding allowed you to scale your program and be more innovative in your approaches to increase the number of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis teachers, particularly in your region?
I think before I talk about the money, we need to talk about having the courage in our thinking to believe that we can do this, to acknowledge that the current system is not supporting its success for Indigenous youth for the most part, or at least not for all. And if we want our children to believe in themselves, we need to believe in ourselves, to believe that we can do this, that we must do this. And in fact, in 1970, our ancestors occupied the gymnasium in an old Indian residential school, and with the belief that they could take over the school and create a better learning environment for their children, because they did not, their children were not getting what they needed in either the residential school or the public school systems. And they'd been in public schools for about 15 or 20 years by that time. And so they said, no, we can do this. And of course, the government laughed and the church opposed, but our ancestors prevailed. And so it's been a bit over 50 years that we've been learning how to do this. And initially we were operating an elementary and high school, and then began quickly to expand and bring in post-secondary programs to meet the needs of our communities. And but we were bringing post-secondary programs from other institutions. And just there was nothing Indigenous about them necessarily. And over time, they'd maybe add a little piece of this or that. But still, it wasn't it wasn't birthed through our knowledge and through our ceremonies. And so in the 90s, we began developing our own programs. And I'm proud to say now that we've got something like 28 credentials in 17 different programs, and programs that have been developed by our own people and delivered by our own people. This funding has allowed us to expand that work. And we have offered for many years, since the 1970s, what we call the BEd transfer program. So it's essentially taking the first 2 years of a Bachelor of Education program. And that started in a partnership with the University of Alberta in the 70s. And then students, once they completed the 2 years at Blue Quills, could go to the U of A and finish and get their teacher degree. But they would have an interim credential that would allow them to teach for a while. And then the U of A developed the Aboriginal Teacher Education Program, ATEP. And so Blue Quills was able to host that, which was the final 2 years of a teacher degree, but it would be delivered at Blue Quills. And so our students no longer had to move away from home because, and not just among Indigenous people, but many, many communities realize that when young people have to move away from home to get a post-secondary degree, they don't all come back and serve the community. And so this is going to allow us to create a program that really is birthed from within, and have it all happen at home. And we welcome learners from all cultures, not just Indigenous learners. And we've had great success, especially in our teacher programs and our social work programs, of other people who live close to us coming to Blue Quills because they see something that they're not finding somewhere else. And in fact, we've had people who were signed up to go to a social work program at another university, and when they learned about the Blue Quills program, they said, no, that's what we need, because of its Indigenous context and knowledge. And so we see the same happening with our teacher education program that we're developing. And just it's going to allow us to develop 3 streams of teacher education, elementary, secondary, and nistameyimâkanak. How to be an immersion teacher in Neckoway or Cree language. And so we've been planning this work for years. We haven't had the resources to do it. And so we're happy now that the resources are available to support the program development, the curriculum for this program, and also the work ahead of us in accreditation and certification. And we know that you have to have a license to teach. And so we will have to work with the province. We respect the provincial requirements for program and teacher certification, but we're also in the process of working with the National Indigenous Accreditation Board and the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium. And following the lead of Hawaii, they've established a precedent. Their Indigenous Teacher Education Program is accredited by WINHIC, and it's acknowledged by the state. And we've had some conversations with the province of Alberta, where we are, or where they are in our territories, and about teachers trained in other jurisdictions, because we know that teachers trained, for example, in Saskatchewan or Ontario can teach in Alberta. Teachers trained in France and Spain can teach in Alberta. And so we've started that conversation with the province about understanding that First Nations owned and governed institutions are just another jurisdiction, and that we can work together. And of course, we always want to know that we are at a minimum meeting, and we strive to exceed the standards that exist in other programs, so that we're doing education plus, if you will, from what you'll find in most other places. And so it's going to support us to go down that pathway of accreditation and certification. And you know, we think about the systems that exist, and we need to address those school systems, because if they were working, we wouldn't be talking about this. If they were working, our people would not be at the top of all the negative statistics. And so we need to do this to be able to turn that around, and to understand that there are different ways of doing things, that despite all the assumptions and maybe even the best intentions, we are not all the same. We do not all learn the same. We do not all know the same. And I believe Creator made enough room in this world for all of us. We just have to figure out how to make that work. The reconciliation keeps coming up, and it came to me one time that reconciliation invites us to illuminate the insidious intellectual infrastructure of imperialism and individualism. And so to some degree, we need to not dismantle or deconstruct, but we need to carefully examine the system that has been imposed upon us and look at how we can create our own programming that will walk alongside that system, but not necessarily become us. And I remember a student brought a quote to class one day, a Yiddish proverb that said, "If I'm so busy being you, who's going to be me?" So we need to be us. And that's what this program will allow. The funding will allow us to create a teacher education program that will do that.
Wow. So many pieces I was scribbling down as you were talking and sharing. And so really, really interesting to, get a bit of the history that preceded this. And I think for, it doesn't matter what the project is, it always starts somewhere. And in this case, it sounds like it started a long, long time ago, and then it moved into a university space with, yourself and neighboring university before you're now moving, really into leading this, so that this program can work alongside of other teacher education programs in the province and the country and the world. And so I'd like to allow Ramona, if I could get you to speak about how the funding has allowed you to scale up your program and be more innovative in your approaches to increase the number of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis teachers as well.
Okay. Thanks, Denise. I think, like Sherri, I'm going to take a pause for a minute and before I answer the question around the new opportunities and pathways that this funding is going to create. I just wanted to emphasize and really pay homage to the role and the vision that the elders had in developing and advocating for our Kinanau Bachelor of Education, or our Kinanau model here at UCN. They realized, in the conversations that I'd heard about educating, I'd heard them talking about the understanding and the awareness they had about systems and pathways that existed, not meeting the needs of Indigenous communities and Indigenous students as part of those communities. And so I'm really excited about the funding that we've received, because it's going to allow us to amplify the vision, or kind of give life to the vision that they had. We're proposing on creating staggered entry and exit points for language learning pathways and land-based programming. And again, it's with that view of decolonizing education. And it's incredible to hear and listen to the elders who were involved in the development of our Kinanau model here at UCN. They were talking about those concepts and those understandings long before we had this contemporary language to talk about it. So, this funding is going to allow us to create pathways and components of a program that's going to give students that opportunity to really learn about their place and their place in the territories that they're from up here in northern Manitoba. And the elders emphasized the importance of recentering some of the knowledge that we take into our classrooms, and recentering the knowledge to really reflect the history and the teachings and the knowledges of folks in the north and Indigenous communities in the north. So for us, the funding is going to allow us to develop and create new programming, new pathways. I'm really excited about the innovation that we're going to be able to bring into some of the projects that we're anticipating taking on with this funding. You know, there's just so many neat technologies that are on the horizon, and, you know, being able to develop resources and tools that student teachers, that our students can take and utilize as, you know, tools that they can carry forward into the spaces that they go into is really exciting. And yeah, that's kind of what I can say about what the funding is going to allow us to do here at UCN. In Manitoba, we know that there is an incredible shortage of Indigenous language teachers. So our proposal was really focused on creating capacity and building language teachers and helping develop and create pathways so that we could help fill this incredible gap in Manitoba with respect to Indigenous language teachers here in Manitoba.
Wonderful. Miigwech, thank you for that. And really happy to hear that these funds will help your program continue to grow as well. I'd like to hear from Melanie about the next question. So Melanie, with your background, what are your thoughts on what investments we need to see in the Indigenous teacher education sector to create systemic changes?
I think when I first looked at this question, I went, whoa, this is a bit of a loaded question, because by investment, it means that all parties have to be on board to get it done, right? I know I really appreciated Ramona saying decolonize, because that's one of the questions that I think is really being asked. What does that look like? And what will it look like 10 years from now? Investment is that you're going to put the supports behind to ensure that we have education, whether they're First Nation operated systems, ministry operated systems, whether they're First Nation first language systems, immersion systems. You know, in Yukon, what I lovingly say here is we have English immersion systems here and French immersion, but we don't have any First Nation schools in Yukon. We need to be working towards having that and it being a substantive equity piece for our Indigenous peoples. Putting that investment in, most people want to go back to a dollar value, but there is no dollar value that I would ever say would be enough in this. We all have to have the momentum and incentive to want to do this. I see many policies from governments that say, you know, we have a 15% Indigenous population rate that we have to have, and it's never met. They've never come there, and it always comes back to capacity. But it's when we get in there, when you're in that system and you're the only First Nation, it's really difficult. Because you're working in a colonial system. The model of education in Canada is a colonial model. It's only when we deconstruct it and go back to our way and we work with First Nations of this is how we learned and this is how school would be for us, that it truly demonstrates how we can be successful. And bringing that equity for our educators. I can remember many times being asked myself, when I was a principal, how did you get here? And I got there the same way any other principal got there, hard work. I went to school and I put my foot out there to move into administration. But when I reflect back on it for myself, I had a support system. I had elders that I could go and talk to. I had people that were there to hold me up when I wasn't doing so great and to pull me down when I was getting a little bit too cheeky, as simple as that. We need to have those supports in place. That's the type of investment that we need to see. And that when we have no one being left behind, right, not going into a system that they don't see themselves in. It's really difficult to walk into some of our ministry operated schools. And I certainly don't see my Tronakachin self in those schools. And then when you have the pressure of being asked to help to do that, it's really hard not to feel isolated. So building the community around that would support that type of investment is the key piece to it all. So mentorship is a small piece of saying we're going to have that to help the individual. But when you look at it systemic wise, that has to be in there. The criticalness of our language programs. We are our language. And we need to see that within the schools, and our children need to see that within the schools. Those capacities have never been met because the financial investments have not been adequately given to First Nations languages across Canada. That needs to significantly change so that we can build the capacity of our Indigenous language programs. Yukon, our language programs are the most at risk in Canada. I actually come from the traditional territory that we just lost our final fluent speaker. So everything that we learn in our Han language right now is from recordings and from what we call as intermediate speakers. We're not all fluent yet. Those are critical numbers to see across our country, but there are also pieces that are very important to ensure that we're putting those investments so we can have the sustainability and the supports behind our Indigenous educators to say, keep going because you're there, so that our children can see themselves and then hopefully become an educator. So investment is not about just the money. Yes, there needs to be a lot of that, but it's the investments of all the supports around it.
And Miigwech, thank you for sharing that. As you were speaking about all of that, I was having a little moment thinking about my father's generation, who are all fluent speakers, and then my generation, where there's only a couple. I have a few cousins who are really working to build their language capacity, and our educators as well. But also had a really beautiful moment yesterday when we were at the Remembrance Day ceremony at Neckoway on the mountain to recognize veterans and Indigenous veterans, First Nations veterans in particular. We had one of the choirs from one of the schools here in Thunder Bay, and they sang a song in nistameyimâkanak, and they also, two of the students also did one of the prayers in the language. And it was really beautiful after I laid the wreath to be able to go thank the students, for sharing with us both in song and in words yesterday. So it was really lovely. So we do have another question here for the group, and then we'll have a chance for you to have a reflection on each other's, language words that were shared today. So just thinking about, looking forward, looking ahead, what would 10,000 more teachers in K-12 who are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit mean for Indigenous communities and students and the whole country? So across, ocean to ocean to ocean, what would that mean to increase that number and to see that many active teachers across the country?
So it just occurs to me that if we're talking about 10,000 new Indigenous teachers, do we know how many Indigenous teachers there are currently? And that's a question for another time, but it just triggered when you read this question to us again. And I think one of the things that will emerge from this is the things that we just do naturally and we don't always talk about. And as I said in my earlier comments, there's something quite magical about working at an Indigenous owned and governed institution where we just naturally do things our way. We naturally do what makes sense to us based on our ceremonial teachings and based on our language and based on our experience. And so I know that I haven't talked about land-based education, but Blue Quills exists on 240 acres of land. So we have lots of space for learning outside and doing ceremony and taking the land-based learnings inside as well. And we've been doing that in our Neckoway and Bennett programs for years. And that's one of the pathways into the teacher education program is people who have their BA in Neckoway will then be able to carry on into the final 2 years of a B.Ed program. And I think also that when we're talking about this many new Indigenous teachers, It can't be just about Indigenous children and Indigenous teachers. It has to be about all children and all teachers. And so that there's not a high representation of Indigenous people in school divisions. And when we do have trained teachers in school divisions, they're often assigned to teach Indigenous studies or teach languages. They don't always get their own classroom, or if they're secondary teachers, they don't always get to teach some of the other subjects. Sometimes they do. I think especially if they're working in our own schools. But I think that's something that this will help address, is it will get the rest of the country more comfortable with our teachers and with our knowledge if they see them more frequently in all roles. And if the students and the parents and the families see the teachers more engaged in communities, then parents and families will become more engaged in the school system. And they will see it as a more culturally relevant, culturally appropriate learning environment. They'll trust those teachers because they know those teachers. They know who they are. They're not a stranger that's come in after they graduated from university. So I expect that we will see community be more involved than they are now. And that we'll have teachers who will be advocating for their students because they have a higher knowledge base about the struggles that their students might be having, and will be able to help them strategize and navigate through what's happening in their lives. And, you know, I was at a social work research conference a few years ago, and I was offered tobacco to offer some closing comments. And just as I was handed that tobacco, I wondered, how would this world have been different if the first visitors who came to Canada followed that protocol and respected it and said, we're here to learn how to be in this land. And we can't go back 300 or 500 years, but it's not too late. We can still work towards that kind of mutual respect and understanding and make it more natural so that Indigenous people are not just this little bit off to the side, that we're integrated, involved in every aspect of this. We want to ensure that our teacher training is going to give our students everything that they would get anywhere else, but they're going to get more. They're going to get more Indigenous knowledge and ceremony and worldview, so that we can teach science through an Indigenous lens, so that we can teach Indigenous math, so that we can teach social concepts from an Indigenous perspective. You know, our people have experienced educational abuse in public schools, and it's still happening, and it's in the curriculum. We're marginalized, so we need this to be about all children and all teachers working together to create the kind of learning environment that will allow everyone to succeed. And so when I said we need to teach our teachers what we want our children to know, I think we need to teach all teachers. We need to teach all teachers what we need our children to know. And we need to be the ones to teach our teachers what we need our children to know. Because there's a lot of work ahead of us, but I was born with an inordinate amount of hope and no give up. And I believe it's possible.
Hear, hear. I love that hope, but I also just really appreciate the all children and all teachers. And you know, as you know, kids spend 14 years in K to 12, and if they are to have teachers that are able to embed this in all of the work and all the learning throughout 14 years of junior kindergarten to grade 12 education, you know, what an awesome way to learn for everybody. I'd like to pose the question out to Ramona. If you could think about what would 10,000 more Indigenous teachers mean for communities and students across the country as a whole?
Okay, I'm just, the sun has come out again, and I'm trying to dodge it a little bit here. But 10,000 teachers, ultimately for me, this reflects being on the path to reconciliation. here at UCN, we've got a couple of different streams that kind of lead into our Bachelor of Education, our Kinanau program. We've got an integrated Bachelor of Arts. We've got an integrated interdisciplinary Bachelor of Arts. And then we've got the 2-year after degree. So I've been in those classrooms where we're teaching Indigenous studies to students that would enter or transition into the Bachelor of, into the Kinanau program. And you know, for me, 10,000 more teachers means that we get an opportunity again. I kind of keep coming back to this concept of visibility and some of the practices associated with creating the visibility and sharing the rich intellectual traditions, customs, practices of Indigenous communities in these learning environments that have historically been, you know, a little challenging to work in and move in. And, you know, for me, 10,000 teachers, 10,000 more teachers would demonstrate that we're on this path, these miskana together. And it's creating and helping build capacity in Indigenous communities. We're helping grow community. We're helping, again, just reinforcing the importance and the beauty of Indigenous cultures. And, you know, it's kind of in a space that'll help us to deconstruct some of the assumptions. You know, creating visibility for Indigenous knowledge helps us to deconstruct maybe some assumptions that folks might have. And it's a real important component of walking towards decolonization or walking the path of decolonization. I remember the week before last, I was over on the East Coast and heard a presenter talking about reconciliation at this Indigenous Education Conference. And, you know, kind of the parallels that she drew between reconciliation and decolonization. So that's something that really stuck with me. And for me, you know, having 10,000 more Indigenous teachers would be a tremendous benefit for Indigenous communities, but also for Canadians and for folks, you know, that we would engage with or that are out there, you know. So 10,000 more teachers, I think, is a great start, you know, but it'd be great if we could have pursue more teachers. So yeah, Denise, that's all I can say about that.
Thank you very much, Ramona, for that. I would like to also pose this question to Melanie. You know, what would 10,000 more teachers in elementary and secondary school mean for communities and students and the country as a whole?
I'm going to reiterate what Ramona said there and say that it would be a great start. And again, what I've said before is if our kids see one, then they may just want to be one, right? I think of one of our rural communities here in Yukon. The most prominent job in that community is the water truck driver. It's a fly-in community and all of their water is above ground. And so it's delivered daily. That's the most coveted job. And when you ask the kids in class, you know, what do you want to be when you want to grow up? The majority of them say the water truck driver. And that's a very telling tale right there, because they see it and they see the importance of it. And I think that's what our children need to see in our colonial education model right now. They don't see themselves. And so having 10,000 more teachers in there would build that little wave to start and build the capacity where our children would see themselves more. When I first viewed this question, I quickly Googled, well, how many teachers are there in Canada? And on the last census, there are 402,000 teachers across Canada. I would have to say on that would be self-identified because it's done through a census. It's the be able to see us. Also, that increase then creates the opportunity where there's a little bit more, as Ramona had said, of a wave where it's okay. It's very difficult to work in a system where you don't see yourself there. And when there is more, it makes it that much more easy, and you have someone to work with. But more importantly, as that goes along, it allows us to bring the change that has to occur in the system, and bring the value back to what we know as Indigenous peoples of a different way of learning. So that space would be stretched a little bit more to do things differently. I know educators in the system right now are still trying to grapple with, well, what does land-based learning look like? Some regions have that down pat and it's been going very well for years. Some regions don't. And then there are nodes where there are pieces that it's working very well, but others where it's just non-existent. So the space to be able to do things differently, once you build the capacity up where you have more voices, more in the system of saying, hey, try it and it's okay and it's a possibility, then that would expand across. To look at it nationally, it doesn't sound like very much with 10,000. So I agree with the good start. We have a long way to go. My biggest thing would be to say that we could dare to do things differently and increase that capacity where our kids can see themselves becoming a teacher. I also would like to acknowledge that we do need to look at other opportunities within that as we build capacity to honor our educators more, because I think that's something that in our Western world of education, teachers are not honored enough. In my Indigenous worldview, or our Indigenous worldview, as a Trondoqütjin person, the educator is highly revered. We don't see that in the modern school system right now. I've had the privilege of going to other areas across Turtle Island and see different models of school where, you know, teachers in the Finnish model must have a master's of education before they enter in, but they are revered as doctors and lawyers are. We don't see that in our Canadian system. Teachers are not revered. It's a very challenging position to move into. And more recently, the teaching shortage across Canada has really, really impacted a lot of the learning that occurs in our schools. So I would hope that increasing that capacity with more Indigenous educators would bring the greater opportunity to do things differently, but also bring in that perspective of how important it is to be an educator and how we need to hold that up more. Masi.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that little bit, a big bit, but that your final thoughts on really what that means across a whole system. You know, that idea of educators and teachers and those knowledge holders being revered people in our communities, I think is a really, really important piece to think about, of the responsibility that comes with, you know, that calling to become an educator, and then all the work that one does in order to become a very good educator. We have a couple of questions, and we have a little bit of time to go through some of them. We have some questions around language. We have one around ITIPs and community embeddedness. And then we have another question for allies. So I'd like to call Sherri, who has indicated that she has some thoughts on some of the questions. So go ahead.
Yeah, so there was a question about developing programs to support culturally proficient speakers of the language in preparation for becoming language educators. And one of the things that I would say is we need to make sure that our teacher candidates have continuous access to ceremony. that they're immersed in an Indigenous learning environment, so that they're not sort of having to change hats every time they're walking into their learning environment, that there's a continuity, a continuousness there. In our BA in Neckoway, when we have multiple pathways as well, we have language speakers who are proficient and are looking for support to become language teachers. And so that's the premise of our BA in Neckoway is to create fluent speakers. So we have learners who come in who are not fluent. And so we're supporting them in becoming fluent, and then we're supporting them in becoming teachers in the language. But it was never a BEd program. And so now with this project, we're being able to lengthen that pathway so that they're getting everything from the BA and then carrying it into a BEd. So it'll essentially be a BA BEd program. We also have a Master's in Arts and Indigenous Language Revitalization. And so that's creating, I guess, a critical mass of thinking around how we do this. And our students are exposed to that as well. In terms of, I'm just going through some of the various language questions that have been posed. And what about learners who don't have daily access to a fluent or proficient speakers? I think if we create a really strong language learning environment in our schools, in our K-12 schools, and I think about a friend of mine who was born in Britain and came to Canada as a very young child with and came up through our systems. And she decided when her children were young that she would put them in French immersion. She wasn't a French speaker, but her children are fluent French speakers. They didn't have access to somebody outside of their school environment. But then it also inspired me to think, and one of the other projects that we're working on right now is what we're calling an immersion learning community. So it can be people of all ages learning in an immersion environment. And we've created this little cabin, if you will. We've renovated it. So it's like a living space. And so they're learning as they're living. They're not living there full time. They're coming in for whatever time they have available, but they're doing real life activities in the language. And so that gives them some strength. But I think, pardon me, what about after school activities? Imagine if we spend as much time in language in after school activities as we do in sports, arts, any other extracurricular activities. You know, we invest in these things for our children to have greater opportunity. What about with language? So that's what I've got so far on language questions. I've got some other things on a couple of the other questions, but I'll ask my other colleagues to maybe jump in on language. Very excited to hear what they have to say about this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I love that idea of learning as living, and so much of language, you know, from the time that we're, you know, in our parents' arms and our extended family is really language is learned by living. I would like to invite Ramona. Ramona, if you're able to speak about for the changes at post-secondary institutions to support or reestablish community-embedded Indigenous teacher education programs, what would be the next steps for your program or region that could be taken this year?
I think we would, again, thinking here at UCN, we would probably keep doing more of the community outreach. Again, our proposal built on some existing programming and pathways here at UCN. We have the Certificate of Teaching Inuit. If you Google it, it's going to say Certificate of Teaching Inuit, but we've got 2 dialects of Cree up in this territory, and I'm from the TH speaking Cree community. So we would do more outreach and, you know, try and do outreach to build the relationships to create the programming, but also building the outreach to recruit and bring students into classrooms and to different learning environments. Denise, I'm just trying to see the question here in the chat. It would be more beneficial for me to see the question because there was a couple of them in there, and I want to make sure that they're here.
Hold it, I'm just trying to pull it out.
Culturally.
Here it is. Okay, I'm just going to put it at the bottom of the chat for you. There you go.
Okay. See if I can.
Oh, sorry, that was the next question.
Okay.
So would you be able to speak to, so for changes at post-secondary institutions to support or reestablish community-embedded ITEPs, what are the next steps that, might happen in your region that could be taken?
Next steps. So here at UCN, again, I talked a little bit about some of the pathways that existed in our faculty. Our Kina Now program has already taken on some of those steps. So I can't really speak for other institutions that may be operating or that also have community or those kinds of programs that already exist. But I'm really interested in some of Heather's questions, and I'm taking a look at some of the chat here that I can see. So apologies for going a little bit rogue here, but Heather's asking some really great questions around language educators and the preparedness and how this is going to connect to some of the education programs. And this is one of the things that really excites me about this opportunity with and through the Rito Hall Foundation is that we're going to create those opportunities where learners can engage with materials. It's around developing the resources. Again, I'm coming back to innovation and, building tools that community can use at their leisure, making them accessible. What I'm seeing is a little bit of a gap right now with some of the tools and the resources. There's incredible work being done across the country. But there are some language groups that don't have the same kind of access to the same kinds of resources and tools. And I started talking a little bit about the TH dialect. And this is an example in Northern Manitoba here. So, we're developing pathways to incorporate and integrate those particular dialects so that, again, teachers going into community or teachers, working with communities have the tools and the resources that they need in their own languages. So, Denise, that's all I've got for you with respect to that question. And I know I went a little bit off. I was kind of panicking to find the question in the chat box. But
you know what? We got some great questions. And I know we're kind of down to our final couple minutes here before I have a really great announcement to make. But I would like to give an opportunity for Melanie to speak to a different question. And in your view, what's the most effective and appropriate way for non-Indigenous educator allies to work towards Indigenous innovation in education?
I love this question. I think my first comment to that is as soon as you identify as an ally to anything, then you have already done the willing step. Right? Because you're going to step into the realm of unknown and take risks, take chances, make mistakes, make it happen. But the best way to do that is you need to talk to your community. You need to go to the community and find out, participate. I always encourage, I have the honor as being the executive director to the Yukon First Nations Education Directorate of working with the educators in Yukon, providing some professional development on how to build relationships with First Nations. How do you step into that realm and what does it look like? Everyone has a picture of it's going to be perfect and I'm not going to make any mistakes. Well, you are. You also have to come without the assumption that it is going to integrate into that system. I often hear the words, well, we're going to include and we're inclusive and we're going to bring that. But what does that look like? For First Nations, it's sometimes a reverse model where it's not our Indigenous pedagogies and philosophies being embedded into this Western worldview. It's where we take our circle, our drum, and we bring you into it so that you're in part of that fold. And so it feels different, it looks different. And in that uncomfortableness, we're going to ensure that you have that safe space to be uncomfortable. Because you can't do that work of allyship without being uncomfortable. If you're comfortable, then we're not doing our job. You have to be uncomfortable in the unknown. And I would really appreciate anyone who moves into that, because you are a risk taker just doing that. Don't be afraid to take those risks. Relationship occurs over time. It's not going to happen in one school year. It's going to happen over time. And you will get better and better at it. It just takes the effort of more to say, I do want to do that and I want to take the chance and I want to be uncomfortable. Being in the unknown is difficult for humans. It doesn't matter whether you're First Nations, it doesn't matter what nationality you come from. In the unknown, we're all uncomfortable, and you need to just learn how to move with that and participate and learn at the same time, and then take the risk to say, you know what, I'm going to try it. And then we as First Nations have to do the work of saying we're going to support and be there and help and allow you the space to make mistakes. That's part of learning. And I often would do that with my students when I'm working with them. It cracked me up a lot of times when I was working with some educators and they went, well, they don't know that. And I said, but aren't they here in grade 3 to learn that? Like, that's what they're here for. So remember that you're here to learn that. And when you express that and say, I want to do this, then it's the responsibility of everyone to give you the room to do that, learn it, and then try it. Biggest thing, try it. So, Marcy.
Marcy, sounds like great words of an educator. And so thank you very much for sharing those with us and for the questions. I would like to take a moment to thank our wonderful panelists, Dr. Sherri Chisan, Dr. Ramona Neckoway, and Melanie Bennett, for sharing your expertise with us today. I do know that this is being recorded on the YouTube channel, and I know I'm going to be going back to this to do a little bit more listening. I took about 6 pages of notes today as you were speaking, but I know there's things I want to go back in and pull on some threads to delve a little bit deeper. So really deeply appreciate you taking the time to share with us about the very important work that you're a part of and leading in your regions of the world. So thank you so much for that. We've heard some very fascinating insights, and I know myself, but I'm sure everybody also is walking away with some valuable takeaways today. And so again, thank you to the audience for your attention, your participation, and your willingness and desire to come on a bit of a learning journey with us today. I have a really exciting announcement. I'm so excited I get to make it, even though I really didn't. You know, all I'm doing is sharing it with you. But the Rideau Hall Foundation is pleased to announce a new granting call to contribute to Indigenous-led initiatives that will enrich Canada's education landscape by 10,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis teachers through 2 funding streams. This new call will open on Monday, November 18th, so in a couple of days. So we'll encourage you to go to our website to find out more about that. Oh, it's right on the screen here. The Rideau Hall Foundation will invest in innovative projects from coast to coast to coast that reflect pathways for systemic change in Indigenous teacher education and support for teacher retention. And we heard about that teacher retention piece today. The 2024 open call invites project submissions via 2 funding streams. One is under Reinforce and one is under Retain. These 2 themes reflect an overarching commitment to scaling approaches that work and are the most promising in Indigenous teacher education. And secondly, to address teacher retention issues by reducing pressures on First Nation, Inuit, and Métis teachers who are expected not only to teach, but often to develop their own materials and resources in isolated environments. For more information, you can sign up for our newsletter to be notified of the latest news, and you can also visit our webpage at the Indigenous Teacher Education Initiative at the Rideau Hall Foundation, and the link is right there on the screen. Just a reminder that this recording will be loaded up to our YouTube channel following today's session. And if you have any final thoughts or questions, please feel free to contact us at the Indigenous, it's right there for you at the website below. And again, just really want to say thank you everyone for being part of today's event. It's been a fantastic conversation, and we hope that it sparks some new ideas and perspectives for you. So again, to the Rideau Hall team for organizing this, Rideau Hall Foundation team for organizing this. Just want to say, extend thanks, and keep up the great work in supporting this really important initiative across our country, and the broader land of Turtle Island. And miigwech, everybody. It's been amazing to have you. And again, a special thank you to our guests for taking time out of their very busy lives as change makers across this country, and taking time to share with us today. Thank you.